I started my hike early in the morning just after sunrise, when the air was still thick with dew and the world felt untouched. I had chosen a trail that wound through a stretch of dense forest I had never explored before, one that climbed steadily into the hills. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and littered with fallen leaves and pine needles that made each step uncertain. The smell of wet earth and decaying foliage filled my nose, sharp and pungent, and I could hear the faint sound of a stream somewhere below. Everything felt calm and alive in a way that made the rising sun seem brighter than it had any right to be. I had packed light. A small backpack with water, some granola bars, a first aid kit, and a flashlight I hoped I wouldn't need. My boots were sturdy, worn but comfortable, and my jacket was thick enough for the chill of the morning air. As I ascended, the trail became steeper, the trees denser, and the underbrush thick. Every step I took required careful attention. Roots twisted like snakes across the path, and rocks jutted out from the soil at odd angles. It was exactly the kind of challenge I liked, where the hike demanded both focus and respect. About 2 hours in, I reached a part of the trail where the forest opened into a series of ridges overlooking a narrow valley. The view was breathtaking, sunlight spilling across the slopes in gold and amber, mist curling around the tops of the trees. I stopped to drink some water, taking in the panorama, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. The trail ahead looked narrower now, winding between jagged rocks and thick undergrowth, but I was confident. The next stretch quickly proved to be more difficult than I anticipated. The soil had turned loose and sandy, and the roots were slick from the morning dew. I slipped once, catching myself just in time, my hand scraping against rough bark. My pulse jumped from the shock, and I made a mental note to move slower. A little further along, I came to a small creek crossing. It wasn't deep, but the stones were wet and slippery. I balanced carefully, placing each foot deliberately, feeling the cool water rush past my boots. Crossing it took longer than expected, and I was grateful when I finally reached the other side. By midday, the sun was higher, the air warmer, and the forest quieter. I realized that I hadn't seen anyone else since I started the hike. The absence of human noise was both calming and unsettling. Birds chirped, a woodpecker tapped rhythmically somewhere above, and occasionally a rustle in the underbrush hinted at the presence of squirrels or deer. But the further I went, the more I felt the isolation pressing in. Every shadow seemed longer, every sudden noise sharper. I tried to shake off the unease, reminding myself I was experienced, that I had hiked alone many times before, and that I was careful. The trail began to descend sharply, leading into a canyon that cut between two ridges. The path narrowed even more here, bordered by sheer drops on one side and rock walls on the other. My feet slipped a few times on loose gravel, and I had to grab at trees and rocks to steady myself. The canyon was darker, the tall trees blocking much of the sunlight, and the air was cooler, damp, and smelled of moss and mildew. I had to concentrate fully on each step, and the tension in my muscles grew. Around mid-afternoon, as I reached the bottom of the canyon, I came across something that made my stomach knot. There were tracks in the mud, large, deep, and widely spaced. They looked like they belonged to a bear or possibly a large dog, but I couldn't be sure. My heart started to race, and I reminded myself that I had bear spray in my backpack, that I had been trained for encounters like this. But the trail was narrow, the walls high, and there was no easy place to retreat. Every snap of a twig made me jump, every rustle of leaves sounded like it could be something approaching. I slowed my pace, scanning the trees for movement, listening for any sound other than my own breathing. Hours passed. The sun began to lower, and the shadows stretched across the canyon walls. I realized I had underestimated the time it would take to navigate the treacherous path, and panic started to set in. I had no cell service, the nearest ranger station was miles away, and I was beginning to feel the weight of isolation pressing down like a physical force. I knew I couldn't stop here, couldn't let darkness find me in a place where a single misstep could send me tumbling down a steep slope. By late afternoon, exhaustion was creeping in. My legs ached, my backpack felt heavier, and the chill from the canyon started to sink into my bones. The trail turned upward again, and I began a steep climb that left me gasping for air. Sweat ran down my back and stung my eyes. I had to rest every few minutes, pressing my palms into my knees, trying to steady my heartbeat. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me, a branch snapping, a low growl, but when I turned, there was nothing. Night fell faster than I expected. The last slivers of sunlight disappeared, leaving me in a dim, gray darkness. I switched on my flashlight and moved cautiously, The beam bounced over rocks, roots, and the occasional patch of low-hanging branches. My nerves were frayed, every sound magnified. Somewhere in the distance, a rock tumbled down the slope and I froze, listening as it hit the canyon floor below. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow. I realized then that even small things became terrifying in this environment. I kept moving slowly, using my flashlight to trace each step, careful not to twist an ankle or slip. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to stay logical. I tracked the direction of the trail, the markers on the trees, anything that told me I was going the right way. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint glimmer of light ahead, moonlight reflecting off a clearing. Relief flooded me and I quickened my pace. The clearing opened onto a small meadow at the top of the ridge. I could see the faint outline of the forest beyond, and to my absolute relief, a ranger station in the distance. My legs were trembling from fatigue, but adrenaline surged through me as I stumbled towards safety. I reached the station just as the wind picked up, carrying a chill that made me shiver violently. The ranger on duty looked up as I approached, eyes widening at my disheveled appearance. I didn't even try to explain, I just leaned against the doorway, breathing heavily, feeling the tension in my body unwind. After a hot drink and a warm blanket, I recounted my hike in my head, thinking of every misstep, every moment of fear, every sound in the forest that had made my heart leap. I realized how close I had come to serious injury, or worse, if I had fallen or lost my footing in the canyon. But I also felt a strange sense of pride. I had survived a day that tested every part of me physically, mentally, emotionally. I had navigated isolation, fear, and exhaustion, and I had made it out safely. By the time I left the ranger station, the night sky was full of stars, crisp and clear. I hiked back down the safer, marked trail toward my car, feeling the weight of fatigue but also the clarity of relief. The forest seemed calm now, almost welcoming. The fear I had felt earlier was replaced with a quiet respect for the land, the danger, and the effort it had taken to navigate it. I drove home slowly, replaying the day in my mind, knowing I would remember it in vivid detail for years. That hike had scared me more than I expected, but it had also shown me what I was capable of, and that sense of accomplishment made every scraped hand, every bruised muscle, and every racing heartbeat worth it. I set out that morning without much thought. The sky was pale blue, and the sun had just begun to spill over the ridges of the mountains. I had chosen a trail I had never been on before, a narrow path that wound through dense pines and scrub. My backpack was heavy but balanced, filled with the usual water, snacks, first aid kit, a small knife, flashlight, and a thin jacket. I had left my phone in the car. I wanted the hike to be a proper escape, unconnected, quiet. At first, the hike was pleasant, almost meditative. The crunch of pine needles under my boots, the occasional caw of a crow overhead, the scent of damp earth and old wood filled my senses. The path was steep in some areas, dropping suddenly into gullies or climbing over loose rocks. I moved carefully, taking deliberate steps, feeling the muscle strain in my legs and the rhythm of my heartbeat in my chest. As the hours passed, the forest thickened. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, leaving the trail in mottled shadows. I noticed that the path was becoming less defined, with fallen branches and thick underbrush hiding the trail markers. My pace slowed as I realized I wasn't sure if I was still on the main path. I thought of turning back, but something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe curiosity. Then I heard it. A sudden snap of a branch not directly behind me but somewhere close. I froze, heart pounding, scanning the shadows between the trees. There was nothing there. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the sound had been sharp and deliberate. I shook my head and forced myself to take a step forward. Minutes later, I noticed the underbrush moving again, this time more subtle, a rustling in the shadows that seemed to follow me. I turned sharply, looking for the source, and saw nothing. My senses heightened. Every rustle, every crack of a twig felt like it was magnified. I kept walking but stayed aware of everything around me, the shift of light, the bend of the path, the occasional hollow sound of distant rocks tumbling down slopes. By late afternoon, the sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows that twisted strangely among the trees. The trail became steeper, and I was forced to use my hands to steady myself on the rough bark of trees and loose rocks. My legs were tired, but the thought of losing daylight pushed me onward. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any footprints other than my own for miles. No sign that anyone else had been here. No animals, no discarded wrappers, nothing. Just the forest, dense and quiet. Then the unthinkable happened. I misjudged a step on a steep incline, my boots slipping on loose gravel, and I fell sideways into a narrow ravine. The fall was not long, but I landed hard on my shoulder and elbow. Pain shot through my body, but I was alive. I tested my shoulder, wincing, but it was functional. My backpack had shifted but remained strapped to me, cushioning some of the impact. I realized then how isolated I truly was. There was no one around to help, no easy way back down. I struggled to stand, leaning heavily on a tree, my boots slipping on loose soil. The trail I had been following vanished into the tangle of rocks and roots below me. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest around me had become a confusing maze. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to slow my breathing, to think logically. I knew I had to find either the trail or a landmark that could guide me back. Hours passed. My legs ached, my hands were scraped and bleeding from gripping rocks and branches, and my shirt was damp with sweat. I found a small stream, the only clear sign of life I had seen since I started descending. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere familiar, but the stream twisted through the undergrowth like a snake, leading me deeper into uncharted territory. By now, the light was fading fast, and the forest had taken on a strange, oppressive quiet. Even the birds had vanished, leaving only the whisper of leaves in the wind. Darkness fell quickly. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, illuminating twisted roots and jagged rocks. Every step had to be measured. I realized that if I didn't find a safe place to rest soon, exhaustion would overcome me. I spotted a small clearing with a large flat rock and decided to make it my temporary camp. I emptied my backpack carefully, setting my water and some energy bars within reach. I wrapped my jacket around me and tried to keep my mind from spiraling into fear. The night in the forest was unnervingly still. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. There were occasional sounds, branches snapping far away, the distant rush of water, the scuttle of small creatures, but nothing that approached. I thought about the dangers I might face: hypothermia, dehydration, or injury. I thought about my family and friends, and the sudden fragility of being completely alone hit me like a wave. When dawn arrived, the forest looked completely different. Shadows receded, and the sun pierced through the canopy, giving me the first clear view of my surroundings in hours. I studied the land carefully. There was a slight ridge leading upward, and in the distance, I could see what looked like a faint trail cutting through the trees. My body ached, every muscle screaming, but I forced myself to move. Step by step, using the ridge as a guide, I made my way toward it. By late morning, I reached the trail. It was narrow, overgrown, and partially blocked by fallen trees, but it was unmistakably the path I had started on. Relief flooded me, but I moved carefully, knowing that fatigue could easily lead to another fall. I slowed my pace, steadying myself with my walking stick and careful placement of my feet. My shoulders and legs screamed with exertion, but I kept going. As the afternoon progressed, I descended into familiar forest, recognizing landmarks I had passed hours earlier. My sense of direction, sharpened by fear and necessity, guided me steadily. When I finally emerged onto a wider path that connected to the parking area, I sank to my knees, breathing hard. I was dirty, scraped, and exhausted, but I was safe. The hike had been harrowing, a true test of endurance, observation, and mental resilience. I realized that nature was not inherently terrifying, but it demanded respect, awareness, and preparation. From that day on, I never underestimated a trail, never ignored the signs, and always carried backup supplies. The forest behind me was silent and beautiful, no different than it had been that morning, but I knew it held hidden challenges, dangers not obvious until confronted. And yet, walking back to my car, feeling the sun on my face, the ache in my body, I felt an odd sense of gratitude. I had survived, learned the limits of my strength, and understood the quiet intensity of being truly alone in the wilderness. The fear had been real, but so had the clarity that came afterward, the clear knowledge of how to navigate, survive, and respect the natural world. By the time I reached the car, my hands were blistered, my clothes torn, but my spirit was stronger. I took a long drink from my water bottle, leaned back in the seat, and finally exhaled. I had faced the forest at its rawest, and I had come out the other side alive, wiser and more cautious. The experience would stay with me forever, not as a story of terror, but as a lesson in endurance, awareness, and respect for the untamed world. I set out early that morning before the sun had fully risen, determined to hike the trail alone. I had been planning this for weeks, mapping out the route carefully, checking the weather, packing water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I wanted to challenge myself to see how far I could go and how self-reliant I could be. The trailhead was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel as I adjusted my backpack and started walking. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. Mist clung low to the ground, rolling gently across the trail, and the sky was a pale gray that promised clouds but no sun yet. At first, everything felt normal. The trail was well-worn, bordered by tall pines and rocky outcrops. Birds sang intermittently, and I could hear the distant rush of water from a stream somewhere off to the side. I moved steadily, enjoying the solitude, the way the forest seemed to breathe around me. Every step I took made a soft thud on the damp soil, and the smell of pine needles and decaying leaves filled my nose. The trail climbed steadily, and after about an hour I reached a narrow ridge. From there, I could see the forest stretching endlessly below me, fog weaving in and out of the trees like soft clouds. I paused to take a sip of water and adjust my backpack. That's when I noticed it. A narrow side trail, almost hidden behind a fallen log and a thick cluster of ferns. It wasn't marked on my map, but something about it pulled at my curiosity. I debated briefly and my head turned back, stick to the main trail, but the urge to explore won. I told myself it was just a short detour, maybe a loop back to the main path, and stepped onto the narrow track. The side trail was different immediately. The air felt heavier, wetter, and the forest darker despite the morning light. Tree roots snaked across the path and rocks jutted up, forcing me to watch every step. The sound of the stream faded, replaced by the creaking of branches and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It felt like the forest was closing in around me. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that this was all part of being in the wilderness, that I'd read about these hidden trails before. As I hiked further, the trail became less defined. Moss covered most of the stones and fallen branches blocked the path. My boots made squelching sounds in the mud. I had to push through thick undergrowth, the brambles scratching my arms and legs. I could feel my heartbeat picking up. The forest felt alive in a way that was almost threatening. Every shadow seemed to move, every wind gust sounded like a whisper. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Then I noticed the sun had climbed higher, and yet the forest remained unusually dim. The canopy above was thick, blocking the light, and I realized I had lost track of the direction I was heading. My heart started to pound harder as I looked around for any sign of the main trail. I tried to retrace my steps, but the side path was no longer visible. The ground had shifted. The forest floor looked identical in every direction, a tangle of roots and mossy rocks. Panic crept in slowly, a cold, heavy weight settling in my chest. I checked my phone. No signal. Not a single bar. I cursed myself for taking this detour. The longer I stayed there, the more the forest seemed to swallow me. I could hear water again, but now it sounded farther away and unsettlingly close at the same time, like a trick of the mind. I decided I had to keep moving to find a higher point, maybe a clearing where I could see something familiar. Hours passed, though it felt like only minutes. My legs ached from the uneven terrain, and my backpack felt heavier with every step. I kept slipping on moss-covered rocks, scraping my hands and knees against rough bark and stone. My water supply was low and my stomach grumbled. The forest was dense, shadows long and oppressive despite the daylight. I realized that I was completely alone, with no one knowing exactly where I was, and the reality of that made my chest tighten. Then a sound caught my attention, a low, deep growl. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't human. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear, a mountain lion, some other large predator. I had read about encounters before, knew the advice. Don't run, make yourself look big, back away slowly. But my heart was in my throat and my legs trembled. I carefully stepped back, trying to stay calm, my eyes scanning the shadows. The growl came again and I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. I remembered my whistle in my backpack and quickly blew it 3 times. The sound echoed through the forest, sharp and piercing. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then the growl faded. Whatever had been there moved off, maybe scared by the noise. I exhaled slowly, my body shaking with adrenaline. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to find the main trail to get somewhere safe. I climbed a small ridge, scrambling over rocks and roots, and finally reached a clearing. The sunlight poured in, warm and reassuring. In the distance, I could see the faint outline of the main trail winding through the trees. Relief washed over me. I moved quickly but carefully, avoiding the slippery rocks and roots, and after what felt like hours of tense navigation, I finally stepped onto the familiar path. Once I was back on the main trail, I allowed myself to slow down. My legs ached, my arms were scratched, and my clothes were dirty, but I felt safe. I could see other hikers in the distance a couple of miles away, and the sound of their voices was a balm to my frayed nerves. I drank water, rested on a rock, and just breathed. The forest behind me seemed less threatening now, just trees and shadows. I made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon. The sun had started to dip behind the mountains, casting long golden rays across the valley. I packed up my things, checked my phone, which finally had signal again, and sent a quick message to let someone know I was safe. As I walked back to my car, the weight of the day's experience sank in. I had been scared, disoriented, and alone, but I had survived. The lesson was clear. The wilderness is beautiful, yes, but it is also unpredictable and dangerous. Curiosity can lead you into trouble if you're not careful. I had underestimated the forest, the hidden trails, and the silence that can mask danger. I promised myself that next time I would stick to my plan, respect the unknown, and never let curiosity overrule caution. That night, I sat in my apartment, scrubbing the mud off my boots and replaying every moment. The fear was still there, lingering, but so was a sense of accomplishment. I had faced a raw, real threat, not a storybook ghost, not a made-up monster, but the cold, real intensity of being lost and alone in the wild. And I had come out of it safely. From that day on, every hike I took was approached with a new respect. I learned to read the trails more carefully, to check my bearings constantly, to keep a whistle and a map close, and to always have a plan. The memory of that hidden trail, the growl, the endless green maze of trees, stayed with me, a reminder that the wilderness does not forgive mistakes easily, but it rewards awareness, caution, and respect. I remember the morning clearly, the kind that starts quietly, with a chill that seeps through your clothes and makes the first steps of a hike feel heavier than they should. I had decided to head out early, well before the sun climbed too high, to tackle a stretch of trail I hadn't explored before, a series of ridges that cut through the forest, known among hikers for its sharp turns and steep drops. I wanted the solitude, the feeling of being completely alone in the wilderness, which I had always found both freeing and grounding. That morning, the air was crisp, scented with damp pine and soil from a light frost that had melted under the weak sun. I strapped on my pack, checked my water supply, and began walking. The crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots was the only sound, and at first, it was comforting, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the forest. The trail began gently, winding through a dense canopy of oaks and maples. Light spilled in scattered beams, casting long shadows across the ground. I remember the quiet vividly. It wasn't the silence of empty space, but a deep, almost oppressive quiet, as if the forest were holding its breath. Somewhere above, a bird called out, its sound sharp against the stillness, and for a moment I felt at ease. But as I moved further, the trail narrowed and the underbrush thickened. I had to duck under branches, step over roots, and navigate around fallen logs that blocked the path. Each step required attention, not just to avoid twisting an ankle, but to keep from losing the trail entirely. About 2 hours in, I reached a clearing near a ridge. The view opened up into a valley below, and I could see the haze of early morning mist clinging to the distant hills. I stopped to take a drink of water and rest, leaning against a moss-covered rock. That's when I noticed the first subtle sign that something wasn't quite right. The trail behind me, normally clear and marked, seemed faint. I squinted, scanning the ground for the painted markers on trees I had been following, but they were sparse here. The leaves and soil seemed to have been disturbed, and I couldn't tell if it was just erosion or something more deliberate. Shrugging it off, I reminded myself that this was a rarely hiked path and markers could fade or be covered. I finished my water and continued, keeping a closer eye on my route. The ridge was steep and the path became rocky, forcing me to move slowly. The rocks were damp, slick with moisture from the melting frost, and I had to use my hands to steady myself in several spots. My breathing grew heavier, not just from the climb, but from the awareness that I was alone in a part of the forest few people ever visited. There were moments when the wind would rush through the trees, sending a chill that made me shiver despite my layers. The sun was higher now, but the dense canopy kept the trail shaded and dark. After what felt like hours, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led further along the ridge, climbing higher and tapering into a narrow ledge that promised views but looked dangerous. The other path descended sharply into a thicket that seemed tangled and almost impassable. I chose the ridge, thinking the climb would give me better footing and a safer way to navigate. That decision, in retrospect, is what made the hike terrifying. The narrow ledge was treacherous. On one side, the ridge dropped sharply into a steep slope, thick with loose soil and jagged rocks. On the other side, a sheer wall of rock rose, covered in moss and small ferns. I had to keep my balance carefully, testing each foothold before committing my weight. As I inched along, I realized how isolated I truly was. My phone had no signal and I had only a small map that showed general terrain. The reality hit me. If I slipped or injured myself, it could be hours or even a full day before anyone noticed I was missing. That's when I heard it, a low, repeated snapping of twigs somewhere downhill. My heart jumped. At first, I thought it was wildlife, maybe a deer or a bear, though it sounded deliberate, like someone moving carefully but deliberately through the underbrush. I froze, straining my ears, listening as the sound came closer, then faded, then repeated in another spot. My mind raced through possibilities, all of them unpleasant. A hiker, someone lost, someone following me. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, but every step felt heavier, every creak of rock underfoot more pronounced. I started to pick up my pace along the ledge, trying to maintain a rhythm without risking a misstep. The snapping noises kept shifting around me, never close enough to identify but always present, like the forest itself was alive with movement. I moved past a section where the ledge narrowed to just a foot wide, with loose gravel that slid slightly under my boots. One wrong step and I could have rolled down the slope. I focused on breathing, steadying my body, keeping my center of gravity low. Eventually, the trail opened up into another clearing. Here, the ridge widened slightly, giving me room to set my pack down and catch my breath. I scanned the area carefully, looking for any sign of whoever or whatever had made the noises. There was nothing, just the forest stretching out around me, still and heavy. But in the dirt, I noticed footprints, two sets, human, one larger than the other, both fresh. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here recently was still somewhere nearby. I debated whether to turn back, but the ridge behind me was tricky to descend, and I worried about losing my way entirely. I decided to push forward, moving faster but cautiously. The path began to descend gradually, the terrain less precarious but still uneven. The further I went, the more I noticed signs of human presence: broken branches, a piece of discarded rope, and more footprints. I felt a creeping sense of unease, a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. Hours passed. The trail eventually led me into a denser part of the forest. Light barely filtered through the thick canopy and the air was damp, almost suffocating. My legs were exhausted and I had to stop periodically to rest. That's when I saw something that made me freeze entirely: a makeshift camp, abandoned, with a small fire pit surrounded by stones and a few scattered belongings. The ground was trampled and the smell of smoke lingered faintly. Whoever had been following the trail had been here recently, maybe within hours. My fear spiked. I realized that I couldn't be sure if I had been alone in the forest at any point. I forced myself to stay calm. I checked my map and identified the nearest point where the trail reconnected with the main path. It was miles away, but it was my only option. I left the clearing cautiously, keeping my eyes on the ground, listening for any movement. The descent was slow and exhausting, each step a reminder that fatigue could be dangerous in this environment. By late afternoon, I finally reached the junction with the main trail. The forest opened slightly, letting in more light. I could hear distant sounds of other hikers, the faint crunch of boots and occasional laughter carried on the wind. Relief washed over me. I moved quickly, following the main path, my pace steady but not reckless. The signs of life, the presence of other people, grounded me. I wasn't alone anymore, and the isolation that had weighed so heavily on me began to lift. Eventually, I reached the parking lot where my car was parked. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I locked the car doors, feeling the tension leave my body in waves. I drove away slowly, taking deep breaths, replaying the day in my mind, aware of how fragile a sense of safety can be when you're alone in the wilderness. That night, I slept deeply, exhausted but grateful. The fear had been real, intense, and raw, but I had made it out. I had stayed cautious, observant, and deliberate. The forest was still wild, still unpredictable, but I had navigated it, and that reality, the skill, awareness, and patience that got me through, felt like a victory more profound than any simple trail hike. It stayed with me for weeks after, the memory of narrow ledges, broken branches, and the sound of footsteps in the quiet forest. But it also reminded me of something vital. Fear is powerful, yes, but preparation and focus can carry you through even the scariest moments. And sometimes, simply making it out, alive and unhurt, is an ending worth every ounce of fear that came before. I had always loved hiking alone. There was a certain peace to being out in the woods with nothing but my own thoughts and the rhythm of my boots on the trail. That morning, I had woken early, long before the sun fully rose, and packed my gear. A sturdy backpack with water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a map, compass, and a flashlight, even though I didn't plan to be out after dark. The weather was crisp and cold, the kind that made your lungs feel sharp as you inhaled, and the sky was a clear blue. I chose a trail that climbed steeply into the hills. It was remote, not one of the popular tourist paths, and I liked that. I liked the solitude. The first few hours were uneventful. I passed through dense pine forests, the needles underfoot muffling my steps, and crossed a small stream with water so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom. Birds moved through the trees, their calls occasional and far off, adding a serene soundtrack to the hike. I kept my pace steady, making sure to drink water at regular intervals and keep my energy up with small snacks of trail mix and jerky. Around midday, I reached a clearing that opened onto a ridge. The view was spectacular. Rolling hills stretched into the distance, fading into a haze where the sun hit the valleys just right. I stopped to take photos and rest, sitting on a large rock, letting the wind wash over me. The air was cooler here, the sun only partially warming the ground, and I realized I had underestimated the climb. My legs were burning, but the beauty of the landscape kept me motivated. I continued on, following the trail that hugged the edge of the ridge. That's when I noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the soft dirt, bare footprints. They were large, wider than a normal human's, and the toes were elongated, but they looked freshly made. I froze for a moment, my stomach twisting, trying to rationalize. Maybe someone had come through this way before me. But the trail was supposed to be isolated. I glanced around. No one. Just the trees and the rocks. My heart picked up pace, and I felt that prickling sensation of unease crawl over my skin. I decided to keep moving, telling myself I was just imagining things. The trail started to descend into a narrow canyon, walls of rock rising steeply on either side. Shadows had begun to grow longer, even though it was still early afternoon, and the sunlight barely reached the bottom of the canyon. The air was cooler here, damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth and moss. My boots slipped slightly on loose gravel, and I had to watch every step. Then I heard it, a low, heavy thud echoing off the canyon walls. I stopped immediately, straining to hear. There it was again, closer this time. Not a voice, not a growl, but something heavy, deliberate. My pulse raced. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar. I had a small bear spray can in my pack, and I quickly slid it into an outer pocket. The sound continued, irregular, moving parallel to me. Each time I paused, it seemed to pause too. I started walking faster, careful not to stumble, trying to make my way out of the canyon. The trail twisted, and I began to notice more signs of movement. Broken branches, scuffed dirt, and more of those oversized footprints. They weren't following a straight path, they seemed almost to be circling me, always staying just out of sight. I tried to stay calm, thinking about the safety tips I'd read for wildlife encounters. Make yourself look big, make noise. But I didn't dare shout, fearing it might provoke whatever it was. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow ledge along the canyon wall. It was steep on one side, falling several dozen feet into a rocky ravine. My heart was hammering, and I realized the light was fading faster than I expected. The sun was dipping behind the hills, and the canyon walls were swallowing the last rays. I had two options: turn back, which meant retracing my steps through the darkening, twisting canyon, or continue forward, hoping the trail would lead to the other side. I chose forward. The path narrowed further, forcing me to walk single file, brushing against the rock face. I kept my flashlight ready, though I didn't want to use it unless absolutely necessary. Every sound seemed amplified: the scrape of my boots on stone, the rustle of leaves above, the occasional distant thump behind me. And then I saw it. A dark shape moving along the side of the canyon, partially hidden by shadows. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person, not exactly. The shape was upright, bipedal, but its movements were strange, awkward. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose rock. I caught myself, heart racing, and pressed against the canyon wall, trying to steady my breathing. I realized then that I had been followed the entire time, silently watching me. Panic surged. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, swinging the beam toward the shape. It froze, then vanished into the shadows. My mind raced with fear, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get to safer ground. The trail eventually opened into a small plateau higher than the canyon floor, with a view of the valley below. I could see a dirt road winding through the trees in the distance. Relief washed over me. I hurried down the plateau, keeping my flashlight ahead, scanning for any sign of the figure. The path was rocky, uneven, but the sight of the road kept me moving, my fear driving me faster than exhaustion could slow me. By the time I reached the road, the sun had completely set. The sky was dark, dotted with stars, and the canyon below was an inky black void. I could see the headlights of a car approaching in the distance. My hands shook as I waved, and the vehicle slowed, stopping near me. I explained quickly that I had been hiking alone and had gotten lost, my voice trembling. The driver nodded, calm, and offered to take me to the nearest ranger station. As we drove, I glanced back toward the canyon. It was silent now, empty, almost serene in the moonlight. My fear remained, lingering in the pit of my stomach, but I felt a measure of safety now that I was on the road, away from the isolation and shadows. At the ranger station, I reported the footprints, the figure, and the strange sounds. They listened, taking notes, but I knew there wasn't much they could do. Remote trails were unpredictable, and some encounters could never be fully explained. That night, lying in a bed that didn't move or creak, I replayed the hike over and over. I realized how easily a small misstep could have turned the situation deadly. How quickly isolation could twist the familiar into something terrifying. And yet, I also felt a strange sense of clarity. I had trusted my instincts, stayed calm, and kept moving. The fear had been intense, but it had passed. I promised myself that I would hike again, but I would be more prepared, more aware of the signs of the wild, and always respect the unknown. The woods had scared me, yes, but they had also reminded me that survival is often about focus, observation, and the will to keep going even when the fear is real and immediate. That night, I slept deeply, exhausted but alive, carrying with me both the terror of the hike and the satisfaction of having faced it and come through unharmed. I set out early that morning, carrying only a backpack with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, my jacket, and my phone. The trailhead was quiet, barely touched by the sun yet, with the forest holding a calm stillness that felt almost sacred. I had chosen this hike on a whim, a remote trail I had never attempted before. It promised solitude, which was exactly what I wanted. The air was crisp, biting slightly at my skin, and the smell of wet pine needles and damp earth filled my lungs as I started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, narrow but manageable, winding through dense forest. The sunlight poured in thin shafts through the tall pines, and I felt almost serene. My boots crunched softly against the soil, and the occasional bird call or rustle of a small animal moving through the underbrush reminded me how alone I really was. I liked that. The silence, punctuated only by nature, made me feel alive. About 3 hours in, I reached a section where the trail narrowed further, hugging the side of a steep hill. The ground here was uneven, slippery with wet leaves and moss, and I had to pay close attention with each step. My heart rate picked up, not out of fear but concentration. I had always liked that part of hiking, the way it forced you into the present moment, demanding every ounce of focus. As I continued, I noticed the trail markers became less frequent. I paused and looked around, realizing the forest seemed denser here, the trees growing closer together. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, and the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. I knew this section was less traveled, but I hadn't expected it to feel this enclosed, almost suffocating. I kept walking. After a while, I heard something behind me, a low, crunching sound like someone stepping on dry branches. My heart jumped and I froze, straining to hear over my own breathing. But there was nothing. I shook my head and told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the undergrowth. I tried to ignore it and continued, though my pace quickened slightly. The trail soon became almost non-existent. I could follow the general direction, but there were no markers, no clear path, just a faint line where the earth seemed more worn. I debated turning back, but I had come too far to give up. I pressed on, telling myself the path would open up eventually. Hours passed. I realized I had underestimated the terrain. I had to climb over fallen logs, squeeze through thick brambles, and occasionally scramble up steep rocky inclines. My legs ached, my arms scratched and bleeding slightly from the brambles, and my water supply was running low. So I pushed forward. That was when I heard it again, the crunching behind me, heavier this time, closer. My stomach tightened. I stopped abruptly, listening. The sound didn't repeat immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following me. I glanced around. The forest looked the same in every direction. Dense, dark, and uninviting. There was no other hiker, no signs of human activity at all. Panic started to seep in. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a hiker had taken a different trail and was behind me. But something in the way the sound had shifted, uneven and slow, made me uneasy. I tried to move quietly, stepping softly on the moss, careful not to make noise. I told myself I was just imagining things, that fear was making my senses exaggerate everything. But deep down, I knew the feeling of being watched was real. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. It was overgrown, the grass wet with dew, and in the center there was a large rock formation. I climbed onto it, thinking I could get a better view of my surroundings. That's when I realized how lost I truly was. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. No trail. No markers. Just trees and shadows. I checked my phone for GPS, but there was no signal. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. Panic turned into a heavy, icy fear. I knew I couldn't stay in the forest overnight without preparation. My first thought was to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same, indistinguishable from the others. I could feel exhaustion creeping in. My legs were trembling, my fingers numb, and my mind raced with every possible danger. Injury, exposure, hypothermia. I decided to stop moving for a moment and assess the situation. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my pounding heart. Then I remembered my emergency whistle in my pack. I hadn't needed it so far, but now, with darkness approaching, it seemed wise. I blew it in 3 sharp bursts, listening carefully after each. Silence. Only the distant wind through the trees. No response. I realized I couldn't panic. The forest wasn't going to change because I was afraid. I needed a plan. I looked around for something that could help me find direction. There was a slope leading downhill, partially visible through the trees. Water usually flows downhill, and trails often follow rivers or streams. I decided to move in that direction slowly and cautiously. Every step I took, I listened, scanning for the sound behind me, but I heard nothing. I walked for what felt like hours, carefully navigating the uneven ground. My legs screamed, my stomach grumbled, and the chill in the air worsened as the sun sank lower. Then finally, I heard it, a distant sound of running water. My heart surged. Relief mixed with renewed focus. I headed toward it, careful not to slip on the wet rocks and roots. After a while, I reached a small stream. The water was clear, and I knelt to drink, feeling some of my fear wash away with each sip. Following the stream seemed logical. Even if I couldn't see the trail, water often led to areas where people traveled, or at least to lower ground, which might bring me back to civilization. I followed the stream cautiously, my boots wet, my clothes damp. Darkness was settling, and I knew I had to find a safe spot to rest before night fully took over. Eventually, I spotted a flat area slightly above the stream, shielded by trees, and I settled there. I ate a small snack, refilled my water, and tried to rest, keeping one ear on the forest around me. Morning came slowly, the forest muted in the early light. I felt stiff and sore, but there was a sense of relief I had made it through the night. I followed the stream again, hoping for a sign of human presence. Hours later, I saw something familiar. A narrow, worn trail marker partially hidden in the brush. My heart leapt. I was back on a recognizable trail. I followed it carefully, and soon the trail widened, becoming more defined. The dense, oppressive forest began to thin, sunlight breaking through in brighter, warmer shafts. I could see the distant outline of a road. My pace quickened, excitement and relief flooding through me. By the time I reached the edge of the forest and saw a car parked by the roadside, I was exhausted, muddy, and bleeding in small places, but safe. I leaned against the car for a moment, catching my breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. I had been scared, truly terrified, but I had survived. I realized then that the fear, the disorientation, and the exhaustion had taught me more about myself than any easy, smooth trail ever could. Hiking alone in the wild had tested me, pushed me to my limits, and forced me to rely on instinct, patience, and careful planning. I drove home slowly, still shaky, but with a sense of accomplishment. The forest had been frightening, relentless, and unyielding, but it had not broken me. I knew I would hike again, but this time with more respect for the wilderness and more preparation for its unpredictability. The fear I felt that night stayed with me, a quiet reminder of how fragile human confidence can be in the face of raw nature, but also a reminder of resilience, clarity, and the deep satisfaction of overcoming something genuinely challenging. By the end of that day, I understood something crucial. Survival is not about being fearless, but about keeping your mind clear, moving carefully, and making each decision count. And that lesson, learned in the forest, stayed with me long after the dirt was washed from my boots. I remember the day like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. I had decided to go on a solo hike, something I had done a few times before, but this time I wanted something more challenging, a remote trail in the mountains, one that was supposed to be beautiful but not crowded. I woke up early before the sun, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. I packed my bag carefully. Water, some granola bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, my phone, and a small map. I had checked the weather the night before, and it seemed clear, cool in the morning but warming by afternoon. I told myself I was prepared, as I always did, but deep down I knew there was something different about this hike. The trail started off easy enough, winding through thick forest. The smell of damp earth and pine was strong, the kind of smell that makes your lungs feel full and clean. Birds were chirping, and the sun was just starting to peek through the trees, casting long shadows on the path. At first it was serene, almost peaceful. I walked briskly, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots, but after a while the trail began to climb steeply. My legs burned, my breathing became heavier, but I pushed on. There was a thrill in that exhaustion, a feeling that I was really testing myself. After a few hours I reached a narrow ridge. The trees opened up slightly and I could see steep drops on either side. The wind picked up here, sharp and cold, cutting through my jacket. I stopped to catch my breath and look around. The view was incredible, jagged peaks in the distance, valleys filled with morning mist, but there was a sense of isolation I hadn't felt before. I was completely alone, the nearest hiker probably miles away. Something about that made my stomach twist, a subtle unease I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just nerves, the effect of the height and the wind, but the feeling lingered. I continued along the ridge, moving slowly, careful with every step. The trail narrowed even more, just barely wide enough for one person, with loose rocks and patches of dirt that threatened to give way under my weight. I felt every small misstep as if my life depended on it. I had been hiking for hours by then, my water running low and my legs trembling slightly with fatigue. I knew I should turn back, but I wanted to reach the peak. I always did this, pushed myself further than was reasonable, chasing that feeling of accomplishment. Then as I rounded a bend I saw it. A large rock, jagged and out of place, that hadn't been there on the map. The trail seemed to split around it, but the path on the left looked unstable, the soil loose and crumbly. The path on the right appeared slightly safer but ended abruptly at a steep drop. I froze, trying to decide which way to go. My heart was pounding, not just from the climb, but from the sudden realization that the trail I thought I knew had changed. Nature had shifted while I wasn't looking. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and chose the left path, testing each step carefully. It was slow going. The soil gave a little under my boots and I had to use my hands to steady myself on rocks and roots. One wrong step could send me sliding down a cliff. I moved cautiously, my senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified in the quiet mountain air. I told myself it was just the wind or a bird, but there was a gnawing doubt growing in the pit of my stomach. I tried to focus on each step, each handhold, but my mind kept wandering to worst-case scenarios. Falling, getting stuck, no one knowing where I was. That thought alone made my movements more deliberate, my body tense. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, I couldn't tell. The sun was high now, and shadows shifted as I climbed higher. My water was almost gone, and my legs were sore, trembling from exertion and stress. Then I heard it. A faint sound like a low groan or a grunt, coming from somewhere below the ridge. I froze. I couldn't see anything, just the rocky terrain and the sparse trees. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, a coyote, but the sound didn't fit any pattern I knew. It was slow, deliberate, and it seemed to echo off the cliffs in a way that made it impossible to locate. My chest tightened and I started moving again, quicker this time, eyes darting to every shadow, every rock. The trail became almost impassable. Loose rocks gave way under my weight and the path narrowed to nothing in places. I had to climb on hands and knees, sliding my palms along the rough stone to avoid falling. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I knew that going back the way I came might be just as dangerous. The ridge was thin, exposed, and I could see how easy it would be to slip and tumble into the valley below. Panic was rising, but I forced myself to stay calm, to measure each movement, each grip. Eventually, I found a small flat section of rock, enough for me to sit down. My hands were raw from gripping the stone, my legs trembling violently. I rested there for a few minutes, catching my breath, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. The groaning sound had stopped, but I kept imagining it coming back, louder this time, closer. I drank the last of my water and forced myself to eat a granola bar, though I had no appetite. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and tense, but I knew I had to keep moving. Staying put wasn't safe either. The sun would start to drop soon, and the shadows would make everything more treacherous. After what felt like an eternity, I found a slight dip in the ridge where the trail widened just enough for me to stand properly. From there, I could see the peak, a craggy point that seemed almost impossibly high. I knew I couldn't just stop now. Using every ounce of strength left, I pushed forward. My boots slipped on gravel, my fingers scraped against sharp stones, but I kept moving inch by inch. The wind was strong, trying to push me off balance, but I leaned into it, careful with every step. The air was thin, making every breath a struggle, and my body felt like it was shutting down. Till I climbed. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the top. The view was breathtaking. I could see the valleys stretching for miles, rivers like silver ribbons in the sunlight, forests rolling endlessly into the distance. I sat down heavily, too exhausted to even stand. I felt relief, a deep, soul-soothing relief that I had made it. I took a long drink from my water bottle, though it was almost empty, and just let myself rest. The fear, the panic, the exhaustion, all of it began to ebb away as I looked around. I was alive. I had survived. The descent was difficult, but it was nothing like the climb. I took my time, following a safer path I had spotted from the peak, careful with each step. The sun was starting to lower, painting the sky with oranges and reds. I moved slowly, deliberately, savoring each moment of safety. By the time I reached the base, my legs were shaking, my hands scraped and bruised, but I was smiling. I had made it through, faced a challenge I hadn't anticipated, and come out the other side. There was no magic or luck, just careful movement, focus, and determination. When I finally returned to my car, parked at the trailhead, the relief hit me fully. I felt every ache in my body, every bit of fatigue, but I also felt proud. I had tested myself, confronted fear, and survived without anyone else there to help me. That hike stayed with me not as a story of terror, but as a story of resilience. It reminded me that sometimes fear is real and danger is real, but so is the strength we have to face it and come out the other side. Even now, thinking back, I can feel the cold wind, hear the groaning echo, and remember the way my heart had raced. But I also remember the calm after reaching the top, the clarity in the view, and the satisfaction of knowing I had survived on my own. That hike, terrifying as it was, taught me more about myself than any easy trail ever could. I remember the day clearly, even though it was months ago, and every detail still lingers in my mind. It was early spring and I had planned a solo hike into a section of the mountains I hadn't explored before. I had done plenty of hiking in my life, but there was something about this trail that drew me: its steep cliffs, dense tree cover, and the sense that it was rarely traveled. I wanted isolation, a chance to feel completely immersed in nature, but I didn't expect how intense that experience would become. I started my hike around 7 in the morning. The sky was pale and overcast, the sun barely peeking through. The air was crisp, sharp with the smell of wet pine needles and the faint musk of the soil that had thawed from winter. The trail was narrow, almost hidden under layers of fallen leaves, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Birds chirped occasionally and the wind rustled through the branches, but beyond that, it was a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural. It made each footstep on the packed dirt sound loud, heavy, echoing in the stillness. I hiked steadily, following the path as it wound up the slope. The incline was steep and the soil was damp from recent rains, making some of the rocks slippery. My backpack was loaded with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight, though I hadn't yet needed it. I tried to enjoy the hike, noticing small details: the way the moss clung to tree trunks, how certain rocks glinted with moisture, the occasional animal track embedded in the dirt. There were signs that others had been here before me, but not recently: some broken branches, faint footprints, a piece of trash almost hidden under a bush. That trail felt like it existed in a forgotten corner of the world. After a few hours, the path started to narrow more and the vegetation thickened. I had to push aside branches and step carefully over exposed roots. I was high enough now that the valley below looked distant and hazy, shrouded in low clouds. The air was colder up here, thinner, and it made each breath feel heavier. Then I reached a point where the trail split. One branch continued upward along the ridge, and the other seemed to drop steeply into a small gorge. I checked my map briefly. Both routes were marked, but the ridge seemed longer and less steep. I chose the ridge path, thinking it would be safer, though there was an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach that I tried to ignore. The ridge trail became more rugged, and the soil turned into loose gravel in some spots. Every step needed careful placement, or I could slip and tumble down the slope. I started noticing subtle changes in the environment. The trees grew thinner, more jagged rocks appeared, and the ground seemed to shift under my feet. That's when I first realized how isolated I truly was. There were no signs of other hikers, no distant voices, no rustling that suggested animals of any significant size, just the wind and my own movements. Hours passed and the sky darkened more than I expected. Clouds had thickened overhead and a fine mist started to descend. The mist made everything damp and slick and visibility dropped. I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. The ridge was narrow, with steep drops on either side, and the combination of wet rocks and thin footing made each step a careful negotiation with gravity. My heartbeat sped up, not with fear of people or creatures, but with a primal awareness that one wrong step could mean serious injury or worse. I reached a point where the trail seemed to vanish entirely. The rocks jutted sharply upward, almost like a wall, and there were no clear footholds beyond a certain point. I tried to maneuver around it, but the mist and slick surface made it almost impossible. I realized I had underestimated the difficulty. This was not just a hike anymore, it was a challenge with real consequences if I made a mistake. I decided to backtrack slightly, looking for a safer route, when I noticed something in the corner of my eye, a movement, subtle, quick. At first, I thought it was a shadow or a trick of the mist, but then I saw it again. The faint shape of a large animal, moving with a fluid, almost predatory grace along the side of the ridge. It wasn't aggressive, but it was enough to make me stop. I had my water bottle ready in one hand, not because I expected to fight, but because instinctively I wanted to be prepared. The animal kept its distance, staying just at the edge of visibility, slipping between the trees and rocks. I realized it was a mountain lion, its shape unmistakable, sleek and muscular. My heart pounded, but I kept calm. I didn't move toward it, I didn't turn my back. I started slowly retracing my steps, keeping it in sight without making sudden movements. The descent was slow and deliberate. Every slip of gravel or twist of my ankle felt dangerous, and I had to force myself to focus on the ground, on the footing, while keeping the animal within sight. After what felt like hours, I reached a flatter section where the trees thickened. The mountain lion disappeared, probably moving silently away, but the sense of danger lingered. My body was tense, muscles tight, lungs burning, but I had learned something vital in that moment. Caution and observation can be the difference between life and disaster. Eventually, the trail led to a more familiar part of the forest. I recognized certain landmarks: the twisted oak near a boulder, the fallen log that marked a small creek. I followed the creek down, where the ground was more stable and the mist began to lift. I kept moving step after step until I saw the trailhead in the distance, marked with the familiar wooden sign. Relief washed over me like warm water. I wasn't just surviving, I was finishing a challenge I had almost underestimated. By the time I reached my car, the sky had cleared slightly, sunlight breaking through the clouds and glinting off the wet leaves. My legs ached, my clothes were soaked, and my backpack was heavier from sweat and exertion, but I felt alive in a way that was deep and raw. I sat in the car for a long time before starting the engine, just letting the moment sink in. I thought about the ridge, the narrow paths, the silent observation of the mountain lion, and how small mistakes could have ended everything. But I had stayed calm, focused, and observant, and that had made all the difference. Driving home, I realized that hiking isn't just about physical endurance. It's about paying attention, respecting the environment, and understanding your limits. It's about being aware that nature isn't forgiving, it doesn't care about plans, schedules, or confidence. That day, I walked away uninjured, unscathed, and wiser. I had faced real danger in a realistic, raw form, and I had survived because I stayed alert and cautious. I still think about that ridge, the slippery rocks, the isolation, and that watchful mountain lion. It wasn't a ghost story, it wasn't a fairy tale, it was reality. And reality, I realized, can be terrifying. From that day onward, every hike I take carries a new weight. I prepare more, watch more carefully, and respect the unknown in ways I never did before. That day, I learned that fear isn't something to be ashamed of, it's a tool, a guide. It tells you where to be careful, where to focus, where your limits lie. And surviving, not just the thrill or the challenge, but surviving safely, is its own kind of victory. I can still feel the wet gravel under my shoes, the chill in the misty air, the tension of my muscles climbing and descending that ridge, and the quiet, watchful presence of the mountain lion. It's etched into me. And though it was terrifying, that hike ended clearly, safely, and with a lesson that changed the way I move through the world. I didn't just return, I returned wiser, stronger, and more aware of the fine line between adventure and danger. The mountains remain steep and silent, and I know I will hike them again. But I will never underestimate them again. I remember the morning clearly, even now. The sky was pale gray, the kind of light that makes everything feel muted and a little unreal. I had packed my backpack the night before, checked my boots for mud, tightened the straps, and made sure my water supply was enough for the day. I was hiking alone, which wasn't unusual for me, but this time I chose a trail I hadn't been on before, one marked on the map as challenging, with steep inclines and dense forest. Part of me loved that feeling, the raw, unfiltered wilderness, but another part of me didn't fully trust my instincts. Still, I wanted to test my limits. The first hour of the hike was calm. The trail was lined with tall pine trees, their needles soft underfoot, and patches of moss that seemed to glow in the dim light. I breathed in the crisp air, feeling the burn in my legs as I climbed. Birds chirped above me, and somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgled over rocks. I stopped briefly to take a sip of water, noticing how quiet it felt compared to my usual hikes. The silence wasn't just peaceful, it had an edge to it, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Around mid-morning, the trail narrowed. Trees grew closer together, their roots twisting across the path, forcing me to step carefully. I was climbing a ridge now, and the ground beneath me was damp, slick with morning dew. My boots made a soft squishing sound with every step. I could feel the incline in my calves and the pull in my shoulders from the pack. I reminded myself to keep breathing steadily and to keep a steady pace. Then I noticed the first odd thing. A tree trunk, broken near its base, lay across the path. It didn't seem old. The splintered wood looked fresh, and there were deep claw marks along its side. I paused, staring. My mind tried to rationalize it, maybe a fallen tree from a storm, maybe an animal, but the marks didn't feel right. They were too deliberate, too deep, and they weren't made by any animal I recognized. My stomach tightened, a cold knot forming as I debated whether to turn back. But curiosity pushed me forward, and I stepped carefully over the trunk, brushing my hands along the rough bark. As I continued, I noticed more signs, rocks stacked unnaturally along the trail, branches broken at odd angles, Footprints that weren't mine, too large for a deer, too irregular for a human who had been hiking normally. My pulse quickened, but I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter or someone else hiking earlier had passed this way. Maybe my imagination was just on overdrive. By noon, I reached a part of the trail that dipped into a small valley. The trees were thicker here and the sunlight barely reached the ground. The air smelled damp and earthy, heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil. I stopped to rest on a large rock, unstrapping my backpack and taking a longer drink of water. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of something moving in the trees, too big to be a squirrel or a bird. It wasn't rushing, not loud, just a deliberate, careful movement, like someone or something was tracking me. My heart thumped in my chest and I told myself to breathe. I decided to keep moving, sticking to the trail, trying to stay calm. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Shadows seemed to shift in ways that didn't make sense. Every once in a while, I caught glimpses of something at the edge of my vision, a movement that vanished when I turned to look directly. My hands gripped the straps of my backpack tighter, and I found myself walking faster than I had intended, my boots crunching on the loose dirt. As the afternoon wore on, the trail became steeper and rockier. I had to climb over boulders and navigate narrow ledges. One slip here could have meant serious injury. My muscles ached, sweat soaked through my shirt, and the pack felt heavier with every step. I stopped frequently to catch my breath and scan my surroundings, but every time I looked around, nothing was there. Just the forest. Just the shadows. Then I reached a part of the trail that overlooked a small cliff. The view was breathtaking, a valley stretched below, rivers cutting through dense forests. But my attention was drawn to something else. A series of makeshift markers along the edge, small piles of stones that hadn't been there earlier, arranged in deliberate lines. My chest tightened. Whoever had left these was still nearby, I was certain of it now. I debated whether to continue. My gut screamed to turn back, but I had come this far and the thought of hiking down the same way filled me with dread. I decided to keep moving, but I stayed alert, every sense on edge. I watched every tree, every shadow, every rustle in the undergrowth. Hours passed. The sun began to sink, casting long, uneven shadows across the trail. I was exhausted, my legs trembling, my throat dry. That's when I saw it, a figure, hunched and moving slowly among the trees ahead. Not human, at least not exactly. I froze, not wanting to draw attention, and watched as it disappeared behind a ridge. My mind raced. I couldn't tell if it was an animal, a person, or something else. All I knew was that it wasn't just coincidence. It had been following the trail, following me. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think. I remembered the emergency whistle in my pack and the small flashlight. I couldn't let fear paralyze me, not with darkness approaching. I decided to keep moving, focusing on getting to the ranger station marked on the map. I had no cell signal, but I knew that station was only a few miles ahead. Night fell quickly. The forest transformed into a black maze, the trees blocking out the last of the light. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Every sound seemed magnified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird. I kept my pace steady, moving carefully over rocks and roots, trying not to make too much noise. After what felt like hours, I spotted a faint light ahead. My heart leapt. I ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks, the adrenaline pushing me forward. The light grew brighter, warmer. Finally, I emerged into a small clearing, and there it was, the ranger station. The door was closed, but the lights inside were on and I could see movement through the windows. I pounded on the door until someone answered. Relief washed over me in a wave I couldn't contain. Inside, the ranger looked at me with concern as I explained my hike, the strange markers, and the figure I had seen. He nodded, took down the details, and then told me something that chilled me. A few hikers had gone missing on that trail over the past year. Some never returned. Search parties had found tracks, signs of struggle, and strange markers, but never any clear evidence of what or who was behind it. The ranger said I had been lucky, that most people didn't make it this far without encountering serious danger. I left the station hours later, escorted down a safer trail. My legs ached, my body shook, but I felt a strange sense of clarity. I had survived, and I knew the forest was not something to take lightly. That night, as I lay in a proper bed instead of a tent, I kept thinking about those markers, the figure, and the silence. I didn't know exactly what I had encountered, but I knew one thing for certain. Nature is raw, unpredictable, and unforgiving, And survival isn't about bravery alone, it's about awareness, caution, and respecting forces bigger than yourself. Even now, years later, I remember every detail: the smell of damp earth, the rough bark under my hands, the sound of movement just beyond sight. I remember the cold knot in my stomach when I realized I wasn't alone. But I also remember the feeling of finally seeing the lights of the ranger station, the warmth of safety, and the clarity that comes with surviving something that could have gone terribly wrong. That hike changed me, taught me limits I hadn't known I had, and reminded me that sometimes the scariest experiences aren't made up, they're real, and they demand your full attention. I never went back to that trail, but I still hike alone sometimes, always cautious, always alert. And every time I hear a twig snap behind me or see a shadow shift just out of the corner of my eye, I remember that day and I thank whatever luck or instinct kept me moving forward. I made it out and I learned something far more valuable than any thrill or story. Survival is about respect, observation, and never underestimating the unknown.